Hi, welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Mideast News Hour. This week, we're going to go away a little bit from Israel, widen the prism, because there were just pretty spectacular elections in Australia over the weekend. That we saw the jettisoning of the long-ruling Liberal Party in that country, the rise of the Labour Party, the rise of the Green Party, and a new phenomenon, the independents. And what does all of this mean really for Australia, and specifically for its relations with Israel, and for the position of Jews in Australian society? So, and then we want to move from there to looking at the Australian elections in the context of the larger Anglo-sphere, specifically Britain and even the United States. And so to talk about Australia, I have on a friend of mine, pro-Israel activist and author, Ron Yontov Hutter from Sydney. Ron is the author.
Melbourne.
What's that?
Melbourne.
I'm sorry, Melbourne. I was in Australia in 2017, and I sometimes get the cities confused. But yes, he's from Melbourne, and I've been in touch with him since, and he's always a fount of information about what's happening in Australia and what's happening with the Australian Jewish community. So we're going to start with you, Ron, and then when we widen the conversation, I just want to introduce as well Jonathan Newman. Jonathan Newman here, say hi to everybody, so everybody knows you're here.
Hi there, Caroline.
Hi,
Ron.
Great to have you on the show. So Jonathan is the author of a very important book called To Heal the World: How the Jewish Left Corrupts Judaism and Endangers Israel. And it's about the whole transformation of a minor line in the Aleinu prayer, Letaken Olam, Tikkun Olam, to the be-all and end-all of progressive Judaism, specifically in the United States, but also more broadly. And Jonathan's originally from the UK. And so he's here also to talk about it from the lens of what is happening in Britain, both with the Corbyn phenomenon in the Labour Party and on the left. And now that Corbyn's been ousted from the Labour Party, what the situation is for Jews and for Israel in sort of a post-Corbyn Labour Party. But we want to widen the expanse of the program after we first understand what happened in Australia. So without further ado, Ron, can you just give us a sense of A, what were the issues that people were voting on in Australia, and B, Anthony Albanese, who's now going to become the Prime Minister of Australia, ousting Scott Morrison. He has a fairly long record. Sherry Markson from Sky News Australia put out a whole compilation of his speeches on Israel from 2002 onward of pretty bad things about Israel and how that's evolved over time, and how we're supposed to looking at it now. When he was on the campaign, he specifically said that he does not support BDS and that he does support the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which says that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, and so is demonizing Israel as a Nazi state. So let's start with what people voted on, who Albanese is, and then, more broadly, we'll talk a bit about what this means for the future of Israeli-Australian relations and for Jewish, for the Jews, the Jewish community of Australia specifically. So here you go. The floor is yours.
Okay. There were several issues actually. The issue was a lot about personality. Personality played a very, very big role. They saw different parts of the electorate saw things differently. Men tended to see more of the issues. Ladies tended to see more of personality issues that were important to them. So for ladies, issues were his what they thought his lack of empathy, being insensitive, being slow with COVID as well.
Slow with COVID, you mean that people were saying that Morrison was slow? I mean, I was certain that he would get ousted if he were ousted at all, because of the way that his government was so harsh in imposing closures on Australia, to the point where a lot of people in the United States were wondering whether Australia had ceased to be a free country. He didn't suffer from any backlash for that.
It was that was the state government of Victoria, of which Melbourne is the capital. So we were the ones that were under lockdown, but the other states weren't in that position. So the whole city was locked down. It's got about 5 million people, and the whole place was just locked down. We had curfews. There were helicopters overhead at night. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I wasn't allowed out of my front gate. Even to, somebody got arrested because he put his dustbin, his rubbish bin, for to be collected outside his door, and he got into trouble for that. They wanted to arrest him for that. I mean, it became ridiculous. It became like I don't know, something that was been close to perhaps North Korea, not a liberal democracy. So that was the one thing. But where he had been slow, where they criticized him, was that he was slow to get vaccination drugs, the vaccination to Australia. And he was said it's not a race. And that was used in television ads against him. It's not a race. It's not a race. And he was hammered on that. He's also been hammered on, as I said, on personality issues. He's been hammered on having his eye, when they had floods and fires in Australia, especially in Queensland and New South Wales, that he hasn't been forthcoming on what they call here climate change, about global warming, is it's called climate change here, and he didn't react strongly enough and fast enough to deal with that. So that's what happened. So the electorate depends who you talk to. Millennials and female Australians, those were the most important things. Climate change and his lack of sensitivity, or his alleged lack of sensitivity, and LGBTQ rights. Those were the things that concerned millennials and these people. Climate change was very, very big. And he, the number 2 person in Australia, the most senior person after Scott Morrison, is a gentleman that belongs to an Orthodox shul. He's a very bright guy. He's an intellectual. He's very smart. He's astute. His name is Josh Frydenberg, and he's the member for a district called Kooyong. And it's a blue ribbon seat since 1901. In other words, it's always been a conservative liberal seat. And this is
in which city? In which city?
In Melbourne. We talk about Melbourne, yeah. And it's just such a safe seat. And he got knocked out. And he's stunned. Everybody's stunned. Part of the whole election process that happened was there was some things that have never happened before. We had a gentleman called Mr. Holmes A. Court. He has an organization which seems to be murky, called Climate 200. And Mr. Holmes A. Court belongs to the Holmes A. Court family. He's a billionaire. I think he was Australia's first billionaire. And he bankrolled all these independents. They were all women. They're all more or less in the same age group, in their mid-40s to late 40s. They all seem to have the same kind of hairstyle. They all look the same. And these independents were there that went up against these safe seats.
So can I just interject for 1 second? I mean, what I find really interesting about what you're saying is that, opposed to, say, US politics, where you see progressive issues like climate change, or the gender issues, or even likability, sensitivity, and things like that. On the one side, you also have issues about economic growth, immigration, energy policies, so that there's a balancing that, that you're not just running on either progressive issues or more traditional or conservative issues, or bread and butter issues. But here, the laundry list that you've been sort of putting out, they're all seem to be progressive issues, or he's not worrying about us enough. He didn't give us the COVID medications or the vaccines on time. So that's more nanny state issues. And then the issues of LGBTQ plus and climate change. Those are very progressive political issues. So it seems like that was that really, I mean, I saw also some of the write-ups of the elections indicated that those were the main issues that you're setting out right now. And you basically are going through things that were very similar to BBC and other reports about what was on the campaign agenda. I'm surprised there's nothing there that couldn't be labeled essentially as a progressive woke issue.
There were progressive issues in the main. When I looked at or the way the television here focused on interviewing people, shop owners, small business owners, and so on, for them, climate change was the big issue, and this was mostly millennials and female voters.
What about men? I mean, did they have different issues? Were male votes in Australia significantly different? Do you know, in the voter tolls that have been posted to date, whether there was a large divergence between males over 35 or 40 and millennials and females of all age groups?
I don't know if it's been scientifically assessed, but that was the impression I got from what I was watching. For instance, a lot of the men just said, look, I'm interested in the, in the facts and figures of our economy, defense issues and those sort of things. Whereas female issues and millennials spoke more about climate change and Scott Morrison's, what they called insensitive personality. He went on television and he said, I know that I've been a bit of a bulldozer sometimes, but when you were dealing with a crisis like COVID, you have to get things done. And I had to get things done. So they used that against him because he said, now that COVID is basically not the most central issue anymore, I'm going to have a much softer approach. But that's been used against him all the time, right until the last moment in the electorate. And it was hammered by the journalists as well. So it was personality issues was pretty high up on the agenda. And of course, the climate change, because there were floods and huge fires in Queensland and in New South Wales. And they use this as proof of climate change, although you can't prove that it's, climate change. Nobody can prove anything, but it's assumed like that because there's a lot of populism that sweeps across the country. And
so then the other thing though, so there's a lot of faith or whatever in the climate agenda. There's a lot of sense that that's very credible and that people trust it, and that's interesting. But I mean, what I'm thinking about just on a larger scale is that it's interesting the dominance of progressive themes more generally in Australia, and I think you're attesting to that and what you're talking about with the major issues of this campaign were. Is that correct?
And LGBTQ as well.
Right. And LGBTQ, was that all around? Was that females are also concerned about this, or was this a specifically millennial issue?
No, females as well. And what I found also surprising was that it came from very, very upper middle class areas. Smart areas with cafes, smart shops, educated people, professional people. This was the language they were talking. And I was a bit surprised about that because these were usually issues that come from different sectors of the city, different constituencies in the city.
It was interesting. I saw in one of the write-ups that I read today that they were saying that in these very wealthy areas of Sydney that had long been along the coast, and to the from like, I don't know, Bondi Beach to the Opera or something like that, they said that these had all been traditionally liberal conservative areas. The Liberal Party is the Conservative Party in Australia for people who are just tuning in. They said that all of them were lost for the first time. And you mentioned one of them since 1901, and there are several like that that have been liberal conservative districts since the beginning of the 20th century solid, and they were all lost to the party in a significant way this time for the first time in over a century. And what they were saying was that Morrison and his partisan colleagues had really been doing something that we see a lot of in Israel, you see it in the United States, which is that the party and the conservative party, Likud or the Republicans in the United States, that they're actually catering more towards working class, and that the elites are moving to the left. So that I think they said it was Tesla over construction workers or something like that. This was the wealthy class, the business class of Australia decided to move to the left. And like you were saying, a lot of them went to these independent candidates that are very, very progressive, that they were running on progressive agendas on climate and other issues as well.
Well, what was interesting, there were at least from my perspective, our perspective, there were two constituencies that were very interesting. Wentworth in Sydney is a very, very well-to-do area. I think it's got the largest Jewish population in the country, and they had a very, very good member of parliament representing them, David Chalmer. He was the former Australian ambassador to Jerusalem, to Israel.
And he's a very, very good friend of Israel's, David Chalmer. He's a very solid supporter of Israel.
Absolutely. And I didn't think that he would lose. And he lost to this independent. And he was shell-shocked. I know that Jewish people voted for these independents. And he's been shoved. He was, I think, the only ambassador in Israel that actually went to hospitals after there was a terror attack to actually visit the wounded in Israel. And he's a genuine friend of Israel. There's no question about that. And the Jewish community, especially the younger ones, they shouted him. And I spoke to some people who were supporting the independent Jewish people, and they said to me just straight, it's not only about Israel. That was the answer I got.
So I want to actually talk about that more when we open up the discussion more. We bring in Jonathan to this. So but first, before we do that, before we talk about the widen the scope of the Jews and the left and the progressives and the Labor Party, the Green Party, the independents, such as they are, that were elected over the weekend in Australia, I want to just ask about the agenda of the Labor Party on Israel, the agenda of Penny Wong, who's apparently going to be the foreign minister, and of Anthony Albanese on Israel. And so just there's been a lot of talk. I mean, you had Bob Carr, who's a former head of Labor, who's very, very anti-Israel. He really is he's very similar, in fact, indistinguishable on these issues, I would say, in terms of anti-Semitism of his agenda, to Jeremy Corbyn. But he is not the chairman of the Labor Party. Albanese is. And so, where do they stand on Israel? I mean, there's some people who are very, very concerned. Sherry Markson on Sky News Australia put out a whole compendium of his very long history of saying horrible things about Israel going back to 2002. But then other Australian Jews are saying he's fine. He opposes BDS. Like I said at the outset of my remarks, he supports the IRA definition of anti-Semitism that sees anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism. So how are we supposed to look at his positions on Israel, where his party stands on Israel, how his party's stance on Israel is going to impact the Albanese government's position? what can we expect about that more generally? And then when we start talking about the Jews and how they voted and what they're doing, I want to bring in Jonathan as well.
Okay, that's a very interesting thing. I think this is part of a sweeping progressive movement that's going, that's enveloping the Western world. And as far as the Labour Party is concerned, they have a very populist kind of approach. For instance, I mean, you might have seen Albanese talking about they were only throwing stones at people who were driving tanks.
Right,
I mean,
when they were throwing missiles at Israel, that they had
yeah,
5
but
million Israelis in their
a
missile
very
range.
populist. I would also say it's a childish approach to talk. It's a very silly, facile approach, but that's what they do. And the New South Wales, and I think the Queensland as well, certainly New South Wales, the Labour Party of New South Wales adopted a motion a few months ago to adopt a motion stating that Palestine would be recognized as a state. And very senior members of the Labour Party in Australia are in favor of this. At the same time, they talk about a two-state solution, and it's got to be negotiated and all that, but they already discussed the outcome, that it's got to, that they're recognizing Palestine and all this kind of, so there's a bit of a contradiction there. You also have to remember
and Albanese said that he wouldn't. He said that he would support recognizing Palestine,
yes,
even though it doesn't exist. Is that correct?
Yes. The front bench, which is the cabinet of the of this new government now, they are supportive of recognizing Palestine as a state. They're also, when you say BDS, well, I'm not sure what he's actually saying, because on the one hand, he says he doesn't support it. On the other hand, he refused to, or he didn't condemn it. When it happened recently at the Sydney Arts Festival, they boycotted an Israeli choreographer, and he didn't want to. He didn't say anything. He didn't enter, any kind of opinion as to this. So he might be thinking he doesn't agree with the BDS of, say, a company within the Green Lines, but he might be in favor of it in what he would call the occupied territories. So,
well, here's what it says. I think it's important. AJAC, the
yes,
main Jewish organization in Australia, said opposition leader Anthony Albanese vehemently condemned anti-Semitism, boycotts of Israel, and the apartheid slur, but failed to provide clarity on whether Labor would recognize the Palestinian state if elected to government during an online forum with Jewish communal leaders this week. He said he has always been very concerned by people who argue for a one-state solution, calling it a recipe for disaster. Asked about a Queensland Labor conference resolution earlier this year accusing Israel of ethnic cleansing and apartheid, Albanese said he endorsed Shadow Foreign Minister Penny Wong's condemnation of the resolution, in which she said blaming one side will not advance the cause for peace. I think it's notable here. Well, he also said here that that the use of the word apartheid was wrong. He said the term is not only is not appropriate for describing the Israeli political system and structure, it is also, I think, it also cheapens the struggle against apartheid that occurred in South Africa. And he addressed a motion endorsing a boycott of Israel that is to be put to the the NSW conference. Was that what is that called again? NSW, North South Wales. What?
New South Wales.
New South Wales, right. Conference in September with the backing of Bob Carr. Not a single member of my caucus supports that motion, not one. Saying he couldn't see any prospect in which it got to the floor of the conference, adding that it would be totally counterproductive. So, and then he went on to say that he supports IRA. So on these things, he sounds good. But again, he has a very, very long record going back to right before he became the chairman of the Labor Party, opposing Israel, supporting or demonizing Israel. He compared Ariel Sharon in 2002 to Saddam Hussein. He in 2015, he came back from a visit from Gaza, and he said how terrible Israel was oppressing the Palestinians. And in 2018, he said that the government, that the Morrison government or the Abbott government, I can't remember who was in charge at that time, was wrong to be working with the United States to reject a UN Human Rights Council kangaroo court against Israel, that he thought that absolutely the UN Human Rights Council should be investigating alleged war crimes against Israel. And like you said, he claimed that the Gazans who were shooting missiles at Israel were actually just throwing stones, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he has a long record of very harsh anti-Israel pronouncements. And then, but then on the other hand, he has these statements which are pretty strongly opposed to a lot of the really vile anti-Israel antics that are being carried out by people like Bob Carr and others in his party. How are we to look at this?
Remember that there was an election. So he didn't want to get into all that kind of stuff. He didn't want to get into, he wanted to focus on a simple message. The Australian people are doing it tough because of the of what the Scott Morrison government had done with the economy, what they've done with this and doing that, and you know, that they're not inclusive and you know, for all the people of the country, so those kind of issues. So he wanted to keep the message very, very local. I think my view is that that Australia is going to look more like the European Union, and its voting record will not be as supportive as it was under this present government and the government we just had. So I think that it's going to change somewhat and probably follow the European Union to some extent. It won't be as warm and supportive as it was with the Scott Morrison government. No.
Okay, so now, Jonathan, if you don't mind, if you're there, sorry, I wanted to bring you into this discussion now, and just to talk a little bit about where progressive Jews are today when they look at this kind of progressive agenda being carried out by Labour Party in Australia, what we saw and we're still seeing in Britain and the United States, and so on and so forth. I mean, what we saw with what Ron was characterizing was also this Jewish sensibility that, you know, Israel isn't the be all and end all, and that we have to be talking about things that are really important to people who live in our countries. And we care about these issues. We care about climate change. We care about LGBT. TQ plus whatever, and we want to talk about those things. So if you're ready to chime in here, I would love to get your sense really from your work on where this stands now for local Jewish communities in British countries, in Britain and in the Anglo-sphere more generally, because I think that it applies to Australia.
Yeah. Just checking. Can you hear me, Caroline?
I do hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific.
You do have I'm seeing you on two. I see him, not you guys, but I see him on two cameras. One is beneath the chin, and the other one is he's looking straight at it. I like the one where you're looking straight at the camera. If you can possibly use that one.
Try this one. Okay.
Okay, great. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the internet is a bit sketchy over here. So. Yeah, I mean, there's a very obviously, you know, Ron's analysis is incredibly interesting about the way that things are going. I mean, should we maybe talk about where the Labour Party is in the UK a bit to sort of put things in kind of context?
Yeah, because I think that one of the things that's important and really the key question that we see, by the way, we see it in the Israeli left here as well, but is we've seen for the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years, a progressive movement of traditionally liberal parties, liberal, like John Stuart Mill kind of liberal parties, to the hard left. And we've seen it now. We see it very clearly with the Democratic Party today in the United States. We saw it with the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, and we saw it with the Labour Party in Australia under Bob Carr. And the question is whether what we're witnessing today in the Labour Party in Britain, or now what happened with Albanese in Australia, whether this is a course correction or not. And if it isn't, what is it? And if it is, how stable is it?
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's kind of there's sort of a few different layers to it. Because you take someone like Jeremy Corbyn, leaving aside the anti-Semitism stuff and the Jewish stuff in particular, he was quite old school in terms of a lot of his political economic priorities. He was very big on, obviously, a huge sort of spender, and a lot of the immediate sort of woke agenda was not that kind of high on his list. He wasn't really kind of classical, your kind of classical metropolitan liberal in the way that we see today in the kind of the rising generation in the Democrat Party in the United States, and you see it a lot in the Labour Party in the UK today as well. But he wasn't entirely of that bent. And I mean, you saw it, I suppose, in a certain way with Brexit. He was not, he was not in the sort of Keir Starmer, the current, leader of the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, the previous leader of the Labour Party before Jeremy Corbyn. They were dyed-in-the-wool, pro-European, and all of that. And Jeremy Corbyn never was. He was from an older time, from actually that part of the Labour Party, that part of the far left that was anti the European Union.
So they were more like the coal miner types. They were the working class union member, British Labourites, the classic Labourites, and then the new left became much more progressive, much more cosmopolitan, much less working class. So that's the distinction. That's the bifurcation you're talking about, right?
I think that's right. With the only caveat that Jeremy Corbyn in particular was never. Not only was he never a coal miner, he never really did a hard day's work in his life. I mean, he never, was never in the private sector. But those were certainly his priorities. And then there's actually similarities in that respect, I think, with Bernie Sanders to a degree, who sort of tries to speak for that kind of post-industrial world, but they don't really care for him in the same way that they didn't care for in the UK, that the post-industrial North didn't care for Jeremy Corbyn either. And went to Boris, and that's the whole Boris Johnson, and that's another discussion as well. So there is that kind of degree of nuance, but now where Labour is, it's even more of a London sort of centric party, even more of a metropolitan party, and now one of the main fights that they have within their party is over transgender issues, in particular. The sort of second wave feminism versus transgenderism. They have all women short lists for different constituencies. That's local districts, congressional districts equivalent, and in some of them they insist that only women can run to be their candidate in those places. And of course there's a question. Well, what about a transgender woman? A man who's transitioned to become a woman. Can they be on those all women short lists? And there is a divide there, and it bursts out into the wider public every so often. J.K. Rowling has weighed into this sort of thing online, which some of our viewers may have seen. So those are the sorts of battle lines that are kind of now being drawn. So yeah, it's become even more of a kind of wokish thing than under Jeremy Corbyn, but in a way it's not quite as far left as he was on some of the other issues. So it's kind of a bit nuanced in that respect.
It's almost breathtaking how weird this is. I mean that these post-industrial democracies can be just almost bewitched by these very marginal, in terms of the number of people in a population that are directly impacted by them, these very marginal agendas, specifically the LGBTQ agenda. I mean, it's startling just how small a number of people in Western societies are in any way impacted by transgenderism, and yet it seems to be this almost obsessive compulsive topic of conversation in so many of these advanced post-industrial societies. I find that just weird.
No, I think that's right. There's a certain stupidity to it, because that's why it's so much about virtue signaling. It's about finding a cause, however niche. And as you say, these things actually impact so few people that it's not really clear why this needs to be such a grand debate in the way that it is. And you saw it, I think, in 2016 in the States. There was an element of kind of, Hillary Clinton was going on about bathrooms and so on. And, most of the country is just kind of thinking, this is just not remotely relevant to my life.
But yet what we're seeing now with the Australian elections from Ron, what Ron was telling us, and also what's being captured in a lot of the media discussions about the elections and what were the salient issues there, that these in fact were the salient issues. So that's kind of amazing about what it says about where the Australian people are. And so so let me just ask Jonathan, and then turn it to you specifically about Australia, Ron. When you look at this kind of madness, this almost war against Judeo-Christian roots of Western society, is on behalf of these very radical and also very, it's not just marginal, they're like made up issues. Where does that put the Jews? How do the agenda setters look at the Jews in this, and then where does it put the Jews in the mix? Where do the Jews find themselves in this debate, in this discourse, in this political reality that's unfolding, a political reality of unreality in these post-industrial advanced societies?
I mean, whatever the equation is in any society on any issue, you can be sure that the Jews will be on the wrong side of it in terms of how they are perceived by those waging that battle. And you see it today between the sort of the far left and the far right, that for the far right, the Jews, or the far left, the Jews are white, and for the far right, they're not white enough. So whatever is your issue, the Jews will be your enemy. So for the woke brigade, the Jews are on the wrong side of that equation. They are oppressors. They are privileged, and so on. So the Jews are on the wrong side of that. And the question is, to what extent Jewish communities recognize that and how they respond to it. Do they, try to fight it from within? Do they still go to the Women's March and the Dyke March and this march and that march and so on, knowing that they're basically going to be booted out? Or do they say that the entire woke agenda is hostile to the Jewish community, so we really want no part of it at all? That, I think, is kind of one of the contours of the debate in the community. Interestingly, what I will say on the kind of broader side, in terms of the general publics, is that these issues I don't think move elections enormously. I mean, they move cultures for sure. They move corporate cultures. We're seeing that. They move Hollywood. They move soft power and so on. Whether they're able to move entire electorates, I think that remains to be seen. I mean, as Ron was saying earlier, these weren't, I don't think, the central issues in the Australian election.
They were. I mean, what actually, maybe you misunderstood. I mean, what we've been finding from the write-ups, at least, of the election, is that what was moving people to vote was how they feel about Scott Morrison, that they don't like him, that he's not nice enough, and that he's not on the right side of history with either climate change or the radical gender politics.
Yeah, I mean, the whole. I suppose if you put it in the whole kind of package, then yes. But if you're, I guess it depends on sort of how kind of niche it goes. But I mean, transgender issues, for example, are unlikely, I think, to move a whole electorate. But the problem is that what you have in these parties is the people who are the most active and the people who rise up and so on, the people who come in, who are in safe seats and so on, they will be the ones who get to positions of leadership and influence. So eventually, an opposition party is going to get elected. It's only a matter of time, in Australia, in the UK, in America, whatever it is, eventually. So the question is who is populating, the highest office or the highest officers in those parties, who's going to be running the agenda. So you get that whole that whole manifesto, that whole thing comes with it, beyond even just the thing that you're necessarily voting for. So you might not have voted for some of these woke things, but they will come in anyway because those are the people that you are voting for.
So Ron, that's actually an interesting question, because again, we were talking about the difference between the backbenchers and the frontbenchers in the Labour Party today in Australia. And in the United States, we just had 57 members of Congress in the Democrat Party just voting to, or sending a letter, I think, to Secretary of State Blinken saying that they wanted to end or limit U.S. military assistance to Israel, to punish Israel for killing Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Akleh, when it's not at all clear that Israeli forces killed her, and it's certainly not clear why Israel carrying out, or it's completely wrong to think that there's something wrong with Israel carrying out counterterrorism operations in a terror hub of Jenin. So these are, you could say, a minority view in the Democrat Party. The Democrat caucus is more than twice that size, but still it's not true, because people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, AOC, and others who are on the leftward edge of the spectrum in terms of everything, including in terms of Israel and Jews and issues relating to both, they are dictating to a very large degree the agenda in the Democrat Party, both in Congress and in the Biden White House. So that the decisions are being made on the extremes, especially on the left. And when you look at that, you wonder, okay, is that the situation? Is that the situation as you see it in Australia, or is it different? Are the responsible adults actually in charge of the Labour Party? And is the fact that that the incoming prime minister, the incoming foreign minister in Australia have spoken out against these very radical, hostile, anti-Jewish positions from more left-wing members, or more openly left-wing members of their party, mean less than meets the eye.
I think, I think that it's part of a bigger picture. And the bigger picture, I think that certainly within the Western world, I think that there's a move towards intersectionality. I think this idea of linked victimhood has become a political issue. I think that intersectionality, meaning, you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
So
yes.
intersectionality, in case any of the people watching don't know what it is, it's this concept that all progressive issues are related. So that if you're for climate change, you necessarily have to be for LGBTQ. And if being anti-Israel is now part, it's a very strong part, and maybe the foreign policy of the woke agenda. Then if you're woke, then you also have to be very anti-Israel, you have to support BDS, et cetera. So that to the extent that intersectionality is a diktat for progressive parties when they're in power, then you can assume that even if specific politicians don't care that much about Israel or aren't necessarily anti-Semitic, that they're not going to inhibit that agenda. To the contrary, they're going to allow people that, for whom this is the agenda, to advance it as their partners, as their comrades in the progressive cause.
And also, you've got to remember that that they're changing demographics, as in Europe as well. There's also there's a very, very big Arab Muslim community in this country, in Australia, and that's also the constituency where Mr. Albanese comes from. As he comes from that part of Sydney. They've got a growing voice, and they vote, of course.
Are there more Muslims than Jews in Australia?
Oh yes, it's about 5 to 1, at least. Yeah, and they've also been in the news lately because of gun battles, throwing bombs, shooting up in gyms and in fitness gyms and places like that, restaurants, cafes, with just firing up and just shooting them down, rival clans and gangs and God knows what. Mostly from Lebanon, these people. So they've got a problem there with very violent crime, and it's probably got nothing to do with the occupation. I hope not, but they're doing that anyhow. I'm being facetious about because in Israel they use it as an excuse for the occupation, but I don't know what the excuse is here.
Is there a significant rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic acts in Australia emanating from the Muslim community?
Yes, but there's also both far right and far left. Just recently, after a lot of discussion, Victoria outlawed swastikas and Nazi flags. Sometimes people put them up in their gardens, they will hoist a Nazi flag. It's now outlawed. But the day after that law came about, some people went and plastered swastikas on windows, including the Jewish Community Centre in Melbourne, in a very Jewish area. They just plastered, the places were full of swastikas as a response to that. And then about a week or two ago, 2 Jews were badly beaten on the main street just outside a supermarket that also has got a big kosher.
And who were the perpetrators of these attacks?
They arrested a 33-year-old man, but I understand somebody told me he's been released. So I don't know what's gone on, but I haven't heard more about it since then. But one chap, one of these Jewish people was hospitalized. It looked quite bad.
But no, but what I don't understand is this in fact neo-Nazi violence that is being perpetrated, or is this a violence being perpetrated by other people under the banner of Nazism? And if so, who are the other people?
I think this is more right-wing Nazism in this case, but I don't hear the Greens or these kind of people condemning that. But if you say a bad word to a Muslim person, it evokes a lot of a big reaction, but this doesn't seem to get any reaction from anybody. That's the way things are at the moment. So
I'm sorry. So again, when there is a 5-to-1 Muslim-Jewish ratio in Australia, and there's an uptick in anti-Semitic acts in Australia, but you think that the majority of them are being carried out by far-right anti-Semites and not by Muslim anti-Semites. Is that what you're saying?
That's the impression I get at the moment. I know it's not like that in Europe, but but here in Australia, the stuff that's really publicized is just the Nazi, the right-wing extremist Nazis. But I'm not aware of Muslims as such attacking Jews as such.
That's great. That's very encouraging. That's good to know.
But I don't say it doesn't exist. I don't know. I just don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so Jonathan, if we turn it to you, then when we look at this kind of situation of intersectionality, and you have backbenchers, you have frontbenchers in these progressive parties. How do you think this ends up impacting policy, both in relation to protecting Jews in these societies, whether it's in universities or on the streets, from progressive anti-Semites? And where do you think it leads also in terms of government policies, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy, on where it impacts Israel?
So I'll take I'll do the Conservatives with the party of the government in the UK first, and then I'll do the Labour, which is the party of opposition. So what's interesting is that actually, for a lot of the sort of conservative-minded people around the Western world, I think it's the case of the Republican Party as well in the States, that they want to get in on this somehow, but on their own terms. And actually, the Jews are quite convenient for them, because here is a minority that they can sort of get behind in some way. So when people talk about kind of racism, anti-Muslim racism, other forms of anti-Black racism, and so on, kind of the voices that come more from the left, the kind of the right can then talk about, oh, but what about anti-Semitism, and we're doing these things for the Jews, and so on, which is quite interesting. And look, it's good and bad. I mean, on the good side, it means that there are government policies, certainly in the UK, and you see it with I think Republicans as well, that are favourable to the Jews. And there's a lot of sort of, you want to call it virtue signaling, or you call it whatever you want, but that is positive for the Jews. That is, and it just in the Queen's speech just a couple of weeks ago in the UK, this is the speech that the monarch makes to open the new term of Parliament every year, and they included a reference to banning BDS motions and legislation at local councils. That's at the local municipal level, and possibly also on university campuses. It was also in the speech last year. They didn't get around to legislating it, but it is it is a sort of sign of the trajectory. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, very, very pro-Israel, very good friend of the Jewish community, banned Hamas in full. They stopped with this nonsense political wing, military wing distinction. So she banned that in full late last year. So you do get these very good policies coming out of the Conservative Party in government, and you see motions in Congress as well from that are pushed strongly by Republicans on anti-Semitism and so on, because this is a kind of, you wouldn't call it woke, but it's a kind of racism sort of issue that the right-wing parties can get behind. So they latch onto it very, very kind of excitedly, and that has good effects for the Jews. But there's also the downside, which is that it can become a bit of a political football. Anti-Semitism really should be something that unites everyone on the political spectrum. But that is obviously discussed is not unfortunately the case. Then you come to the opposition party. Now, Labour under Corbyn in the 2019 general election lost a large number of seats. They've got just over 200 seats in out of 650 in the House of Commons. The Tories have almost, the Conservatives have I think about or whatever it is, have about 80 or something seats, I think, majority. And what it means is that those who were left on the Labour backbenchers, a lot of them were sort of far left from safer seats, were Corbynistas, were people that Corbyn had managed to parachute into certain constituencies. So it means that you now have this kind of larger and more influential block of far left MPs in the Labour Party than you ever did under Jeremy, in earlier years. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was a backbencher for decades, and one of barely a handful of people who held his views. And now you're looking at potentially 10%, maybe 15 or 20%, depending on how you count, of people in the Labour Party. And it's not only just the numbers now; it means that they're also going to have seniority. When if Keir Starmer were to win an election, he has to find people to populate his cabinet. So you look at a shadow cabinet now, and they're all really old Blairites, for those on the left, but mostly Brownites, people who served under Gordon Brown 12, 14 years ago. I mean, these people are not going to last forever in politics. So who are the people that you're going to have to start, picking from? And they're eventually going to be these sort of Corbynista types, or more likely those who are somewhat sympathetic to them. So it is a problem. One can't just look at the leadership of a party and imagine that, well, that's all that you're getting, because it isn't. You're getting the whole package.
It's interesting, Ron. I was just reading while I was there was a 35% increase in anti-Semitic attacks in Australia in recent years. It says the average number of reported anti-Semitic attacks from 2013 to 2020 was 280. As such, the number of reported incidents is above average by 167 incidents. So there's a very large increase in anti-Semitism in Australia in 2021. And it says also that there was a very steep uptick in anti-Semitic attacks There were two major events that appear to have contributed to the increase in anti-Semitic attacks over the past 12 months, the Israel-Hamas conflict and the continuing pandemic. For example, 88 incidents were logged in May of 2021 alone during the war between Israel and Hamas, and a marked increase in the number of incidents between 22 and 24 and 46 from typically between 22 and 46 from other months. So Operation Guardian of the Walls in May evoked further acts of anti-Semitism. There were deliberate targeting of Jewish community facilities, especially synagogues, Jewish schools, Jewish businesses, as well as the deliberate targeting of private Jewish homes. Much of this targeting took the form of anti-Israel graffiti on synagogues, schools, and the front fences of homes of Jewish families. In another report from the Australian Jewish News, they reported a 38% increase in attacks, and they said half of them were from neo-Nazis, which assumes then that the other half were from people who are not on the far right. So I think that both of those speak to the fact that there is, in fact, an increase of anti-Semitic attacks that are not specifically from the far right, and that they are inspired by anti-Israel violence against Jews in Australia. So I think I just wanted to point that out. I think that's an important thing to mention.
Yeah, there's also the universities here. Here in Melbourne University, they had a resolution. The students had a resolution where they just a couple of weeks ago.
It was just a couple of weeks ago in the University of Melbourne and also in Sydney, where they both passed anti-Israel BDS resolutions, right?
Yes, very extreme ones, very extreme resolutions. The university didn't act. They just said that it doesn't represent the views of the university, but they don't act. My question would be, of course, if it was against, somebody of color, would they have acted? If it was a misogynist kind of.
So how do the Australian Jews come down on this? I mean, I found, I was in Australia where I met you in Melbourne, and I mistakenly remembered that having been in Sydney, but in Melbourne in 2017. And a lot of the people that I spoke to, both who were more liberal, more progressive, and also more traditional, said that Australia and the Australian Jewish community, in terms of going woke, that they're and also assimilation, intermarriage, that they're about a generation behind American Jews, meaning that they were much more conservative than American Jews. I think you see it with Britain as well, that they're much more willing to stand up for themselves as a community and communal interests. Particularly, we saw it very vividly and really, I thought, very admirably in the elections between Corbyn and Boris Johnson. So what's the pulse of the community in Australia today, at a time when you see really the domination of the political life by a very progressive agenda? Where are they on this? Where do they see themselves in the intersectionality debate and all the rest of it?
I think that as you look at, especially at the millennial generation, I think their sense of Jewish identity is somewhat weakened. There was a generation that came up, that grew up in the 50s and 60s, a lot of them children of Holocaust survivors, but they've got children now, and I would say that they're more concerned about what Jonathan would be calling, of course, what we know as Tikkun Olamists, because they've really fused civil rights with Tikkun Olam as part of the way they express what their Jewish identity. But in the traditional sense, I think the Jewish identity's been watered down to a large extent with younger people, certainly, absolutely. Also, I look at from my own experience. I went to a Jewish youth movement as a kid, and as a teenager, and it was very strongly Zionist. It was Habonim, and I was a madrik there, and I taught them all the things about Eddie Gordon and about everything that we needed to know, and so on and so forth. And but Habonim today, they march with the LGBTQ parade in Sydney and in Melbourne, which has nothing to do with with being a Zionist movement, and they also invite Palestinians as guest speakers. But if you ask them about contemporary Israeli things, their knowledge is very, very poor. I was speaking to one chap who was in his 30s. He's very much against the occupation. And I said, how did the occupation happen in the first place? And he said, I'm not quite sure, but he said it's wrong. It's really wrong.
So when you look at the way that Australian Jews were looking at these elections, what do you think were the issues that were animating their decision about whether to vote for, as they traditionally have in all of these very Jewish districts, for the Liberals, for the Conservative Party, for the Morrison-led party, or to vote for these independents that were motivated much more by the progressive agenda?
I think to a large extent the progressive agenda, and that's borne out by the fact that the very, very heavily Jewish area of suburb of Wentworth in Sydney kicked out Sharma, who's such a good friend of the Jewish community. And then we had the same thing here in Melbourne, where Jews are heavily congregated. They didn't vote in Israel supporting candidates. They didn't. Kuyong, where Josh Frydenberg is credited as having saved this country from a total disaster economically and also the social problems that would have gone with it during the COVID time. And he basically turned it around. And when
he was a treasurer, right? He was a treasury secretary.
He's the number 2 guy in the country. So he was expected now to be the prime minister, the prime minister, the shadow prime minister, because Scott Morrison resigned, and the next guy in line would have been Josh Frydenberg, who's a very, very smart, astute, highly knowledgeable guy with a law degree and an economics degree from Monash, from Oxford, and from Harvard. And he's the smartest guy in the cabinet. Everybody knows that. And he came up with very, very good ideas. He worked very, very hard. He's also very socially conscious, where he visits charity organizations, women's refugee organizations. He visits them and he discusses their problems and issues with them. And this is the kind of guy he is. He's very community-minded, and yet he got kicked out.
And the Jews didn't support him? The Jews in his district turned against him?
Well, he got kicked out. What else? I don't know how else to explain it. Well, I have spoken to some Jewish people, and some of them are progressive. They just told me, well, no, it's not everything about Israel. There's other things as well. And I understand that. Of course, we live in Australia and so on and so forth, and we've got to look at things like, social cohesion and economic factors and health factors and so on and so forth. But this is the answer I got. They're not as Israel focused as they used to be. Certainly the younger generation. They see things in terms of tikkun olam, and tikkun olam, as we all know, is more of a civil rights kind of an issue rather than a Jewish issue or Israel-centric issue as well.
Jonathan, I'm sorry, David. I'm sorry, Ron. But Jonathan, I just want to sort of get an assessment, because when we're trying to think about what just happened in Australia, the rise of the left there, the rise of the hard left in the United States and the Democratic Party and their leadership positions there. What do you think, when you're looking at this as somebody who really has studied very closely Tikkun Olam and how it is really making it very difficult for Jews in these Western democracies to have a genuine, authentic understanding of what it means to be a Jew? How when you're looking at these kinds of things unfolding, do you assess where these communities are going, and where these societies that are going woke are moving in terms of their relationship with the Jews of their countries and also with the Jews of Israel?
I think in terms of the Jewish communities, something that I always say to people is that they need to remember that the United States is, or the American Jewish community is very different from other Jewish communities around the world. It is the only one that certainly that I can think of, is certainly the largest in this case, that is predominantly non-Orthodox. So, you include places like the United Kingdom. From what I gather, South Africa is like this. Israel is also like this, but in a different way that may be secular Orthodox. The synagogue that I don't go to is an Orthodox one, but they are not progressive. And that's not to say that all progressive Jews think necessarily in the Tikkun Olam way, and certainly not to say that all Orthodox Jews don't think in that way. But it sets it creates a kind of context. It is the terrain in which these seeds sort of grow. So that is a fundamental and very, very big difference between the communities. So it means the Tikkun Olam, as it's understood in America, is quite radical. Liberal political activism is not really the case anywhere else to that extent. Talking, for example, about the United Kingdom, you see echoes of it, but it's nothing like on the same scale. I mean, an example I like to use is shortly after the Brexit referendum in 2016, there was, this, you may be familiar, there's a project called Shabbat UK, which I think started out in South Africa as the Shabbat Project or something like that. And it's about taking one Shabbat a year where you encourage people to do a bit more. If they don't do anything, they do a Friday night. If they do Friday night, they do Shabbat lunch, or they go to shul, and if they get closer, then maybe they start keeping Shabbat and so on. And they just had it in the UK, I think last week. And I remember in 2016, there was one progressive synagogue that instead of calling it Shabbat UK, called it Shabbat EU. And this was its kind of sort of protest against, the result of the Brexit referendum that it didn't like, or at least its leadership didn't like. And what you saw there was an example of how, in the phrase Shabbat UK, Shabbat is the emphasis, right? The UK part is just to make it like a nice kind of national thing. When you change it to Shabbat EU, what you're doing is you're shifting the emphasis. The Shabbat part is kind of the irrelevant part. It's the EU bit that's the interesting part. In other words, the political posturing part is the bigger deal. So you definitely see elements of it, you see echoes of it, but it's not nearly on the same scale. I mean, Britain is also not nearly as politicized a society as the United States is, where everything is politicized, culture, movies, Disney, as we're seeing now, everything is politicized, which is not the case in the UK. So it is a very different terrain, but you do see some of these echoes.
On the other hand, while this is true, and I just want to bear it down a little bit, because on the other hand, you see that there are much higher levels of anti-Semitism, both in terms of attacks per capita and in terms of the general venom of the way that the anti-Jewish sentiments are reflected in opinion polls in Britain than in the United States. So, I mean, so it's both. You do have a much more pronounced anti-Semitism in the UK than you do in the United States, even though the level is increasing in the United States.
For sure, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean although I think that's mainly from factors outside of the Jewish community, but it's interesting, as we discussed earlier, in terms of the Labour Party and so on, how the community responds to that, and in the States, some people are starting to pull their heads out of the sand, but it's very slow going, and it's difficult to imagine a scenario where you could have a sort of Jeremy Corbyn parallel, like an Ilhan Omar or what have you, leading the Democratic Party and the Jewish community uniting against that party in the way that it did in the UK. It's still difficult, I think, for us to sort of see something like that happening. I think the heads are too far in the sand, and I think they'd be too slow to get pulled out.
And today, do you think that the situation now that Corbyn has been defeated what you were saying, I think is the key point that you mentioned earlier, was that the backbenchers that are now really the only ones who survived the carnage of the last elections, that they are very radical, and that they will be the elder statesmen of the Labour Party as they start rebuilding after the Corbyn loss, and so that does bode ill for the future of the Labour Party in Britain.
And the grassroots membership. I mean, there's been an enormous purge, but it's by no means complete, and there's still a lot of these sorts of people. I mean, the Labour Party grew into the largest political party in Europe in the Jeremy Corbyn era. So there are still plenty of those people left. And look, the leadership, while it's made enormous strides, is at the end of the day, it's a pragmatic leadership. It's not a principled one. I mean, Keir Starmer sat in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet for years, said basically nothing about anti-Semitism, backed him 100% in the 2019 general election, and only now has sort of said, I'm going to tear out anti-Semitism by its roots and so on. He's not a bad person, and he's certainly made, unquestionably made a lot of progress, but unquestionably the problem still remains, and he is not a kind of principled figure to go after this. I'll just give you one quick example. There was local council elections, municipal elections across the country a few weeks earlier this month, and there was one councillor was particularly got particularly prominent news. This was a Labour councillor in East London who had posted an article that basically justified the genocide of the Jews, the Nazi genocide of the Jews. I mean, this was incredibly egregious, even by Labour standards. Apparently, a complaint was made by an activist organisation to the party a week before the election, and nothing happened. Then, only on the eve of the election, literally the day before, the Jewish Chronicle, one of the main Jewish newspapers, did sort of a big spread on this. And then, within like a couple of hours, she'd been suspended. I mean, she went on to win re-election the next day, but the point is that the party seemed to spring into action when there was bad publicity. They didn't seem so quick, at least according to the reports, to spring into action when the complaint was originally made. So, there are still these lingering concerns that this is about pragmatism and about PR and looking like you're doing something more perhaps than it is about a matter of principle. But, we wait to see.
All right. And Ron, just final words about Australia. When you look at the result, I mean, there were so many reasons to be angry with Scott Morrison, I guess, for Australians, just from a domestic perspective. I mean, but on the other hand, he's being replaced by a party, or really two parties. And the Green Party is very anti-Israel, and by Labour, which is led by a person with a very long record, even though he said, pretty good things in the past. And I also saw that there was a lot of criticism of him going forward and going towards the elections by people in the party, saying that he's abandoning the left for votes, and he's no good because he's not standing by his principles. And so the question is, he's had a long record from 2002 to 2018 of saying some pretty vile anti-Israel things, of having anti-Israel positions on a whole slew of very critical issues. And yet, the Australian Jewish community, or much of it, decided that they cared more about the progressive agenda than about these concerns. And how do you see this unfolding I mean, obviously we're very early on, we just had the elections. What is your level of concern here for where Australia is going in terms of its positions? Is there reason to be optimistic?
Look, I'm a bit I'm concerned, and there are a few reasons why I'm concerned. He's not the only one that's got this anti-Israel animus. There's some people on the front of his front bench that share the same views. We also have a very, very strong pro-Palestinian bent, which is it's really a populist kind of opinion about children throwing stones against tanks and jets and all this kind of thing. It's childish, but that's the reality. So if you look at the Greens, for instance, the Greens basically they were the big winners in this whole thing. They've really increased their seats in the parliament. They've really strengthened themselves quite considerably. And this party declined to meet with Jewish organizations. declines to sign the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And they're going to have a very strong voice in Parliament, which Labour will need, I think, at some stage, because they need 76 in order to have a majority, and at the moment they've got 72. So they've got to use the votes of the Independents and the Greens to push through their legislation, their agenda, and so on and so forth. So at the moment, I don't feel very, very confident about Australia and the Jewish community. I think there's going to be tension. I think that even with the established Jewish organizations that tend to be, I would say, center-left a little bit, they openly acknowledge that there are some major differences, but hope that we can walk towards the good of Australia and be inclusive and so on and so forth. But I think that from now on, I think that Australia is not going to be voting as enthusiastically with Israel, America, and Canada. Certainly, I think they'll be closer to the European Union positions.
Well, I think you both, I just want to, give my take on this for a second. So I think, what we're looking at here really is indicative of a larger problem. Author Douglas Murray talks about it in The War Against the West, his new book, that there are just a lot of very, very powerful forces inside of Western societies that really hate the West and want to undermine it, and opposing Israel as a sort of, it is the distillation of nationhood and the nation state, that if you want to advance a post-nationalist agenda, post-Western agenda, an anti-Western agenda, Marxist agenda, then you're going to go against the most unique people, the most authentic people in history, and that of course targets Israel and of course Jews who support Israel in these societies. And I think it's good that the new leadership of Australia has come out against BDS and all the rest of it. But I think that you have to look at the whole span of their long opposition to Israel and their long hostility towards Israel, and be very concerned. We're seeing where this is leading the United States under Biden, and it's a shame because Australia is also moving towards China and away from the United States. It's going to have a real impact on China and the Chinese American competition, et cetera. But that's a completely different issue. I think for Israel's perspective, it really, again, I say this in every episode almost, that the main thing that we have to be looking towards is strategic independence, and that Israel has to be able to truly back its words when it says that it's capable of defending itself by itself, and to limit its dependence on the United States, and to be able to work with everybody, but from a position of strength and not from a position of begging for assistance, because the world is changing before our eyes. The very fact that very esoteric issues can captivate the attention of the media, capture the agenda of politics, the political agendas in Western democracy after Western democracy, is very troubling, and we have to be looking at this very clear-mindedly and recognize that things are changing and not for the better. So, having said all of that, I just want to thank you both. I want to thank Ron, and I want to thank Jonathan for joining me today. I think it was a very illuminating discussion. I think it's important to understand and keep our eyes out on countries like Australia and of course Britain, and see that what we're experiencing is part of a very, very large trend throughout the Western world, towards something different from what we grew up with. That is, in terms of Western civilization, that's based on Judeo-Christian principles and values emanating from the Enlightenment and from a whole thousands of years tradition of reason, and moving towards something else that's based on feelings and momentary passion. So I think this is something we have to take a close look at, be aware of, follow carefully, and cover and as I say, mind your back. So thank you thank you both very much. Let me get out this last sentence. And I look forward to talking to you again and revisiting some of these issues on later episodes of the Caroline Glick Mideast News Hour. Thank you.
Thank you,
It
Caroline.
was lovely seeing you again. Thank you.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to see you, and I'll be happy to come back and visit you in Australia sometime. Take care.
Oh, you're very, very welcome.